Hello everyone and welcome to RantboxTV. I'm your host today, Matt Gaffin, and we're here to discuss the importance of story in modern culture. Rantbox is a really fantastic podcast I've been getting involved with over the last few weeks, and here we focus on nuanced conversations, especially when there are sort of differing viewpoints. It's increasingly important these days that we are able to engage with one another without resorting to slagging each other off. So it's really great to be here. Today we're talking about stories and modern culture, and this came from a discussion we were having literally just before the episode with Olie, our good friend, who had been watching a recent Adam Curtis documentary, and we got discussing about how storytelling affects modern politics. Olie, do you fancy giving us a bit more context?
Why, hello, Matt the Gaff. Thank you. Yes, I would. So I was inspired by this documentary by Adam Curtis, where, first of all, we touched upon Iraq. So in the early 1911s, I think, there was an envoy of English people that went over to rebuild Iraq. And they were of a certain class and a certain ilk, and they took this strange vision of the English countryside that was part of our folk culture from that time period, and tried to impose it on a completely different landscape that had nothing to do with reality. And it's weird how this ideology was imposed upon these people, and to this day causes the chaos that is modern day Iraq, because the Americans, when they came in, they did the same exact thing that the English did with the invasion. It was really absolutely fascinating. The whole series is about how stories drive us, and whether it's for the good or the bad. So for example, we're talking about the Soviet Union and the communist regime started off with an ideology that started off with a story. It was a story of revolution. Now, in Russia, and so the Soviet Union collapsed, and that story was replaced, and they tried to replace it with democracy, but that really didn't really work out. And instead, you got a man, which was great. They was just like, we replaced it with Putin, a man who believes in nothing. But even Putin started to embrace weird kind of national things to keep him in power, like the Russian Orthodox Church, Russian nationalism. And in China, China didn't break with communism the way the Soviet Union did, but what it did do was it just dropped the revolution story, kept the authoritarianism, and just made it all about money. Ruthless capitalism, without any socialism, without any democracy, just ruthless capitalism. And it kind of showed the problems within China. There's a lot of corruption, there's a lot of suppressed human rights issues, etc., etc., etc. And so what we want to touch upon is, I just got fascinated by it. We need stories. As human beings, we need stories. But what happens when the stories distort or destroy, or when one person's story, whether it's say white English trying to impose upon a different people, a different culture, their story, or when the story is gone and you want to replace it with something soulless, like just money, or the story of the individual and how that's collapsing here in the West as well. And I want to, that's the context of it. Now, fellas, let's take it to the next phase.
Thank you so much, Olie. That was really great introduction to the subject. I find it very interesting what you're bringing up about sort of stories and government, because I kind of see that what is government and the way we rule ourselves, if not a story that we tell ourselves to justify the way we currently live. Guys, John, Olie, you got any thoughts on this subject?
I think so yeah, I guess like to lay the kind of groundwork for what we're saying, I think, yeah, there's definitely a place there where stories are the binding element to sort of all human civilization. That sounds very grand, quite overarching, great story there, but like it is true. You know, like stories are the way we manage to get past Dunbar's number. You know, the maximum number of people that human beings can effectively cooperate with. That is the way that we have evolved from small groups, tribes, into a society that essentially spans the world to greater or lesser extent. But yeah, it's a problem in the sense that I suppose some stories can conflict, some stories can't coexist. But more often, I think, at least in the modern times, the times we are now, like the very recent past, I think the interesting part is that where you come to a place where you live in a nation or a group or a facet of society which has a story, or has had a single story for such a long time, and then small stories start to come up inside, you get cracks and fissures within the unity of a greater story. I think if Britain is the perfect example of that, really, as a whole, where we have the story of Great Britain as a nation, which has always, you know, has this long history of punching above its weight and then apparently saving the world and all this crap. But then also, you know, you get to a point where we are now, where, for instance, there's a lot of people who think, okay, Great Britain is the best thing since sliced bread, stop telling me what to do. And then other people are like, Great Britain is really cool, but that came at a cost. We need to maybe improve that. Or as I think you guys were talking about during the misogyny episode, you know, like the story of, you know, we doff our caps and pull our forelocks for the Queen, or what the hell are we doing? That's the worst thing ever. So it's tough because, yeah, how do you, once those stories start to separate and divide, you create new groups, and then how do you either gel those groups together or let them live in a way that they can be separate? In the modern world, I'm not sure that's even possible. You know, geographically, when our stories divide down social lines, geographically, we're kind of screwed because we have to live with each other. And you end up with London, you know, and then England around it. And, or like, you know, the same thing with like Brighton and everything around it, where you end up with these two very different narratives about what, you know, a people should be, or a method of living should be, or what's right and what's wrong, and politically where we stand. John?
You have a really good point. Several. And I have a question for one of the points that you raised. You said that there are people who believe that Britain have, you know, as a nation, we've saved the world. What do you say to people who believe that story when they don't even consider it a story? They consider it to be a fact that everyone should accept. What do you say to those people?
I think, funnily enough, it's a conversation I've had quite a number of times. I think that story always comes attached to a certain personality. I know that sounds bad. I don't want to generalize too much, but most of the time that story is a simple one, and it's a simple story for people who like short steps and very few levels of conclusion. You know, they are the flag waving.
Wait, they like
variety.
kids' books? They like kids' books? Is that what you're saying? Dr. Seuss?
Kinda, yeah. It's funny you should say that. No, I mean, it's the things of, I'm trying to, it's easy to make this into a them and us, and I don't want to make it into a them and us. Because to be honest, them and us is their thing. You know, they like short stories, simple stories, black and white, hero and villain. Those people who feel the most comfortable with that tend to be the ones that fall into the trap of seeing the place where they are, the team they're on, as something really, really good, and then everything else is not so good or bad even. You know, and yeah, it's a spectrum, but it's difficult to have that conversation sometimes. And I think that everyone, when you sit them down as an individual and, you know, say to them, look, you know, I think we can all kind of come to a point where we know that every great achievement comes in, you know, with the cost of blood, sweat, and tears. No matter what you do in life, that's how it goes. And I think they would all agree with that, but it's hard when you have this current narrative of political thought where the progressive side of politics, often conflated with leftism, but not really, is so keen to address these things and vocally wants to address them now, because let's face it, when is going to be a good time? It's natural for those people to kind of feel a backlash to it. So it's a hard subject. And you say, like, how do you talk about it? Well, slowly, gently, over time.
I have to interrupt because I've something that you said, Oliver, spurred something in my brain and I just jolted. I read this book about Gnosticism and mystery schools, and there's lots of different versions of, like, many different religions had Gnosticism, but I'm going to give you the basic shell of his Christianity. Like, the whole, like, God, Jesus dying in the cross, that kind of stuff. That was like, there was like, they had this belief because they understood the nature of stories. They had, like, the literal belief that the story was real. So people would, like, get into it, right? And then as they evolved within Gnosticism, they would realize that it wasn't the story of Jesus dying and the whole thing wasn't literal. It was actually a metaphor. But when they first had to hook people, like you said, like the flag waving, the people who like small steps, it was like a way of, like, catching people. And then as you evolved within Gnosticism and you studied more in the mystery schools, you would suddenly see, oh, actually, it's not about a guy dying, it's the death of the ego. It's a metaphor, right? But unfortunately, what happened with Christianity, it was just taken over by the Byzantine Empire, and they stripped that, and they just left that and said, this actually happened, right? That's another example of, like, how they understood the importance of the story, got people into it on a certain level, and then slowly educated them. But what happens when that is removed and it's used for authoritarian purposes? The story is used for authoritarian purposes, like Byzantine Christianity. The whole thing was the emperor who adopted Christianity wasn't a Christian, he was a pagan. He just did it to control the populace. And that's, and you could even say, oh, story, heroes and super and fascism too. I think it might be even connected. But I just, when you said people who like, is that what we need to do? We need a bit of Gnosticism. The idea of, like, well, we hook someone with a simple story, and then through a longer process of initiation, we evolve their thinking. Okay, I'll just leave it there.
I mean, I think that's a very interesting point. And it was something that actually Olie had. In fact, we should return to Ollie soon because I'm very conscious that he may have had more to say. But just on that point, it's very interesting, the idea that stories as a device for control versus stories as an ultimately kind of authoritarian tool. And I don't think I believe stories are by nature manipulative, but they are a way that we use to communicate with one another. I feel like it's very, it serves a very easy purpose to use them as a tool for manipulation, though, which is why they become this kind of, like, narrative of control quite often. Olie, did you have anything more that you wanted to add to the conversation?
I guess there's a couple of bits maybe that need clarifying, and I think just to springboard off of stuff that you guys have said, really, which is that the first one is for Olie, really, and Gnosticism, because that's a really interesting point. I think there's an element there where it's hard to imagine in the day and age that we find ourselves now how people felt about Gnostic beliefs, structures, and things in the past. I think there's always this willful misunderstanding where we look back on the past with the baggage of where we are now at Christianity, at paganism, at all sorts of things, with this idea that we already know what that was about. This is a very timely episode because, funny enough, I was just having a very in-depth conversation about this quite recently, where we were talking about the difference between the Judeo-Christian God and say, the Greek pantheon of gods, where Judeo-Christian God is a force of nature. There's nothing you can do that's outside of its influence. But for the Greeks and for a while the Romans, the gods were more like a soap opera than actual deities. If you went to sea, you didn't have to, take cats and sacrifice grain to Poseidon. It wasn't necessary. You didn't want to piss him off either. He was just a guy. He was just a guy that happened to be in charge of the sea. So when something happened that you couldn't really explain, or you needed an explanation that was quick and dirty because you didn't have science, or you didn't have science that was good enough, because let's face it, the Greeks were pretty good at science. It was a good way for these short step type guys, or just anyone, to be like, yeah, look, okay, the seasons change, but that's down to this goddess in the underworld who's sort of like on a shared time system. So yeah, it's cool. But they never thought, there would be punishment or moral judgment from these people, creatures, entities. These stories just explain the way things were in a way that just let them get on with their lives. Because
Oliver, I've got something to say to you about this, because you're really fascinating. One of the reasons the Greek mystery schools did not succeed like Christianity did is, in order to rise up in the Greek mystery schools, you had to be good at mathematics. Right, and that is why Christianity became more easier, because you weren't required to have this mathematical back, because like science and religion were intertwined, as you say, in Greek society at the time, and they were used as within the Greek mystery schools to go through the levels. And when Christianity was a lot easier for mass people to become a member of, and you tend to rise up. You didn't have to have the Pythagoras understanding of mathematics that was kind of very popular, and to get up to the next level, because they had caves and ceremonies and all this stuff. Anyway, I digress. Sorry, just had to put that in there.
I think, yeah, there's an interesting part there with this is a whole episode in here, but really, there's an interesting part there where, like, you get the change from a hierarchical structure of, like you say, with the mysteries and priesthood and so on, into Christianity, which is more of an egalitarian structure, traditionally a sort of aesthetic kind of group. There was a fascinating podcast which I'm sure we can add to the list of links. It's talking about a book that came out quite recently about Christianity and Jesus, and when you strip all of the Gnostic aspects out of the Bible, what's left, and was Jesus a good moral teacher or not? And that's actually quite interestingly related, but I'll have to link that one. But yeah, that is an interesting point, because yeah, you get this, I guess, as it was explained to me, the difference between a hierarchical mentality and the mentality of slaves. That was Jesus's whole thing, is king of the slaves. We all work together, social justice warrior.
He's a communist. I always knew Jesus was a communist.
Well, kind of, yeah, except it's less sort of nationalizing the means of industry and just not having any means of industry at all. He's pretty hardcore. But yeah, I've lost the thread of wherever else I was going to go. So let's skip on, guys. Where do you want to go to?
Okay, cool. Well, it feels like we're kind of coming to a natural lull in the subject. So maybe we'll take it one step on. And I know, John, you had something to say on superheroes and their relationship to fiction. I think it dovetails quite nicely with these ideas of authority as well.
Thank you. I'll try and bridge it, because even though you're saying that we've come to a bit of a lull in that, what Olie was saying, even though you think you got lost, Olie, don't worry. That thicket, that weird woods that you walked us into, I found an olive branch in there. This is the thing. We're essentially talking about the authoritarian and manipulative element that is in story. And the common denominator appears to be men, because these men seem to be able to put themselves into stories in godlike fashion, whether it be Zeus or Poseidon, just pissing off sailors. there's all sorts of these stories that equate a certain kind of power and authority to those who have used brute force to get their way. And even if they don't necessarily use that when they become politically active, they still have command over armies, and those armies are given stories. And we can take all of those archaic examples and put them in the modern day, especially in regards to the people that we were talking about before, Olie, who have this idea in their head of what Britain is, and so therefore going to the Falklands makes sense. You know what I mean? So essentially, we're talking about all these mythic ideas that seem to flood our stories, and to provide a bridge to what I was talking about, which will probably go into more depth in part 2 of this. There's no way we're going to do only one part of this. I've, to an extent, and I've had this before, but again, I'm going through a bit of a malaise when it comes to superhero fiction. If I bar things like, say, The Boys to the side, and how that's a fantastic satirical TV program about modern day consumer problems that we have in terms of what we consume and what we believe in, especially when it comes to certain episodes that deal with being galvanized by either an alt-right force or a just as jaundiced, overly investigative or self-investigative, they say, leftist culture. Superhero fiction for me, unless it's doing all that, kind of feels redundant. And that's because a lot of these superheroes are supposed to be trying to protect the status quo as it is. So they're really super police. And if you've seen my latest posts about the police, you'll know that I'm not necessarily a massive fan of that institution or of the rhetoric that suggests that it's only 1 or 2 apples, because look at any riot. There's more than 1 or 2 people that are mishandling the people that are there to hold a vigil, for instance. So yes, if we're talking about the importance of stories in the modern day, my great gift to this group is that there are fascinating stories to be told. And if you are going to be using, say, superhero fiction or escapist fiction, maybe perhaps bear in mind that even if you do have a wonderful soap opera type plot, at some point, I think there's going to be growing need for these stories that we go to, not necessarily just to be escapist, but to have some kind of, you know, understanding of our world and how it works, and hopefully for us to relate to it, other than it being something that we can, I don't know, buy the toys of, buy the merchandise of, and then find ourselves in this little fluffy bubble and not really consider how these stories could truly be active in society. So
I have a question.
Yes, please.
About stories. What kind of stories do we need to go forward to progress?
Well,
that's what I'm wondering. Like, I was looking at collectivism, I was looking at revolution, I was looking at individualism and socialism, all the things that they touched upon, and they all failed in that documentary series. And I'm like, well, what kind of story can we take going further? I mean, I have individualism as part of mine, music and individualism. I feel those are my stories that I can, that I feel close to. But what else? What else can we do?
Well, oh, sorry, Matt, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, sorry, it touched something that's quite close to me, which is this idea, and it kind of came from what both you and Olie were saying, and especially when we're talking about superheroes as well. Like, it feels to me almost like we're talking about like buying into something, and like the spectacle, of these moral justice tales, right? And it's almost like we're seeing people getting wrapped up in the aesthetics of moral authority rather than engaging with the questioning and investigation of developing good morals within yourself and within building character. So to come back to what Olie was saying, I feel like part of, as a personal opinion, what I think people are deeply in need of these days is maybe slightly less cartoonish villains and a way of actually equipping people with the moral framework to ask, was this right? Not just, was this legal? And like it's not like I'm saying the law is always bad and you should break all of them. But what I'm saying is that laws are not always right and they get changed. And so when we make decisions and we're using the law as a way to judge the moral authority of those decisions, that already feels like the story is kind of worming its way into a dark pattern.
Does anybody remember the TV show Misfits?
Absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah.
because Matt, what you're talking about now is that it is possible for us to create stories which on the one hand serve as a certain kind of fantasy and give us a break from the modern world, but even within that fantasy, you can do things that have social commentary. I mean, Lord of the Rings being one of them, and as I said, Misfits, short version of this tale, you've got a couple of kids, I'd say they're between like say 17, 20 or so, right? And they've all found themselves having to do community service. And in this show, they get struck by, I can't quite remember, but they get powers, a bit like as in the Fantastic Four, in that they have to kind of work together to like get through certain social situations, but their situations are based in the UK. And from what I remember, they're quite adult situations, and it's always to do with either gender, sex. So there was a character that could turn from a man into a woman. And I remember that being really just like, fuck, this is actually happening on TV. And there's nothing to say that, that this hasn't been dealt with in comics, but moreover, whenever something seems to become popular, aside from really good examples like say The Boys, it normally seems to be heterosexual, super police people who seem to be given the aesthetics of morality, as you're saying, but really there's nothing going on there. Like it's a simulacra. It means nothing.
I actually want to quantify that question. I went on a totally different way what I was asking, but that's also very interesting too. I actually want a minute to say what stories for our society can we, like, is it revolution, socialism? All these things seem old and tired. Oh, Olie, you look interested. Yes.
Okay, so I apologize in advance because this may take a little winding path, but I can start with Ola and end up back at John. I think there's a really interesting point there that you've raised, which is where do we go forward? I think many times on this channel, we've reached the dead end of conversation, which seems to be the curse of all modern politics, which is what do we want? Change, but change to what? And that is a huge problem. It's the curse of our time. I think the curse of many people's times, I'm sure. But I think one solution that comes out of this is very much a story-based one, funnily enough. That really works quite well. There are groups, sort of areas of study, groups of people, almost like support groups of sorts, some of which I've had the pleasure of meeting or working with, studying with, where they take the idea of almost reductionist myth and turn it into a functional way of living your life. That's what myths are for. Like trying to teach someone, funnily enough, a problem we come into on this channel and in all political debate all the time is trying to establish morality without context is ultimately pointless. Laws are, by their very nature, trying to establish morality without context. And they fall apart all the time because you can't accommodate for every possible situation. So instead of having laws, we have stories. That's fair. We have myths, the same stories that come over and over again, because it's easier to teach a child or a young person or even an adult the correct response to a moral situation by the medium of showing them many examples, because that's how the human brain functions. It doesn't function on lists of facts and statistics. It functions on concepts and linear stories and paths. So there are groups of people, there are sort of these Jungian myth men, male rehabilitators, people who go back to the fundamental ideas of where these things come from and the symbols they're in, and look at that, rather than say what makes a good leader, or like, how would you lead this country? They go, name me 3 kings from history and tell me why they were good. And everybody knows fundamentally what makes a good king or a good soldier or a good mother or a good father. They know on a base level from their experience in life. You just have to get them to explore that for themselves, because it's not something you can tell them. You just have to give them the examples and let them draw from it what they will. Which comes around to John, which is the point of, yeah, superhero fatigue is a real bitch. Like, I think we all go there as comic book fans, but being the reductionist kind of guy that I am, and always, you know, slightly the bright side type dude, I think the one thing is I always go back to being a kid in this situation. I always look at, yes, superheroes and superhero media and all sort of like heroic drama stuff kind of gets bogged down with continuity and, you know, like just trivia. The comic book guy from The Simpsons, you know, like that guy is the worst thing to happen to comic books because he's not enjoying it. He's just enjoying knowing more than you. And like those guys are the worst. They ruin everything. But when you can step away from that and look at things, you know, like the stories are more important. You know, interestingly, the most kitsch and most hammy characters tend to end up being the ones that do you the most good. I always think of Captain America in this situation. There was a time, I think 20, 30 years ago, where Captain America would have just had everyone going, no, that's just, you know, that's just terrible. This is the hammiest. No one wants to know about American anything. Like, piss off, we don't need a guy in a flag to tell us what to do. But then you come to this and you realize that, no, he is a man in a flag, but the flag represents something else, a story, right? It's not a real story. It never happened. Even in the real life, you know, the American dream never really happened for everybody. But his existence is not that the thing happened. It's his story is striving to make that happen. You know, like Olie says, you know, how will we progress as a society if every time we try something it falls apart? Well, we progress because every time you do anything it falls apart. Nothing lasts forever. Everything goes up and then it comes down. So all you need is to know that, okay, you pick the right route and you keep moving, you keep getting up. When the world knocks you down, you just keep getting back up again. What would Batman do? Well, actually Batman's the worst example, but what would Captain America do? You know, like, what would, if Peter Parker was in this situation, what would he do? You know,
he
like,
would start telling me jokes to make me feel better. He would come up with some great quips. Before there was Buffy, there was Spider-Man. All right.
Exactly. And you know, the thing I always think of is that that incredibly hammy but quite moving speech at the start of Superman. John, though, help me out. There's a thing with Jor-El where he does a big long speech at the start of the Superman movies, and then they kind of reuse it.
Is this with Marlon Brando?
Marlon Brando, yes.
Is the Marlon Brando speech?
That
remember,
is exactly it. You know, it's like that's the point, is that you have to keep trying. You know, like, people are flawed, but the stories aren't flawed because they're not real. You just have to try and live up to the people in them if you can.
Sure.
Someday.
I've got quite a bit to say, as you can probably imagine. I'll firstly go out with this. Like, we talked off camera about how when there's a certain kind of optic in the room, that if you are basically one of a few people who seems to have, like, say, a certain cosmetic feature or gender, then there will be a certain kind of pressure on you to kind of, you know, represent. Yeah. Now, just because I wear this all the time doesn't necessarily mean that I know what Marlon Brando fucking says in Superman. Having said that, there are a number of things that I think that he probably did say that aspire to greatness, and that Superman is supposed to be a force for good and a representative of what is moral, just like Captain America. My issue is, as much as I wanted what you said, Olie, to alleviate my superhero fatigue, which is actually capitalist fatigue in superhero clothing. Not my clothing, obviously, but my main issue is that if we do tell a really interesting story about Captain America being about the ideals and values of the American people rather than the government, which is where I think the US agent version of him in the Falcon, the Winter Soldier program is going. Even if we do tell that story, doesn't it seem almost like I know it's a mythical story, but do we necessarily need that tale told to us again? We know it quite well by now. We're just not necessarily putting it into action, as you were saying. What we could be doing, and I know this won't necessarily sell itself well, because the higher ups, as much as they are presenting us with progressive stories, how long did it take for them to make Black Panther? How long will it take for them to have a member of the queer community be in a form of spandex? It won't necessarily happen as soon as we'd like. Why? Because it's not their power fantasy. Yeah, the old white men who own these studios, whether we're talking about film. One moment, I've almost done. Whether we're talking about film, or if we're talking about the industrial complex of music, whether we're talking about theater, it's the people at the top that have those dreams, and those dreams are being replicated in those media by people that they envision themselves to be as. When we see Black Panther, that is an exception, but even then there is critical thought that suggests that the idea of it is really their fantasy version of being a Black person. Getting Ryan Coogler to direct it is just icing on the top. Anyway, that's my firebomb of a proposal. Ola, what were you going to say?
I was going to say that we had two gay Batwomen, and I know this is teeny bopper crap, but Supergirl has a transgender superhero in it. I don't know if you're aware of this. There is a.
I'm aware of it.
Really well written character. Sorry.
My only issue is that if you ask a grandmother, if you ask someone who doesn't watch this stuff, if you ask somebody who has bought their kids a lunchbox with Batman on the side, these people are not aware of that story, Ola, and that is the issue. It's not being passed down because there's not enough capital behind it. So capitalist fatigue.
It's going on in the TV series. I mean, I don't know. You know, it's on 6 p.m. or whenever they broadcast this. It's before 9 o'clock. Kids are watching it. Okay, so yeah, and sure. We've got Trans Dreamer, is her name, the trans character, and they went through a whole thing with her being trans and the prejudice. So this is like the crappy stuff that you don't even watch Supergirl. I watch Supergirl.
I watched seasons 1 and 2, and then at that point, the capitalist fatigue hit me. And you're right, these stories are not just being told in CW universe, they're being told in comic books as I have talked about them, but only in a throwaway way. I'm talking about the mainstream ideas that seem to be constantly given that push. There is talk that Captain Marvel may be presented as someone who is queer. And when that happens, it may be interesting, but I honestly feel at the bottom line, what they're trying to do to create money will never really be something that is going to caress the idea of giving these interesting stories enough nuance. I'm just afraid that the stories that we're still getting, even in the ones that we've talked about so far, are there to meet a certain quota.
There's probably a bit of quote. Sorry, go ahead, Matt.
No, sorry, I just want to interject there because I feel like one of the things that needs to come up, and I'm a bit tentative about it because it's a whole episode in itself, really. But when we're talking about the relation of capital to storytelling, like there's this thing where what we want is nuanced stories that challenge our perceptions, allow us to make correct moral judgments in a way, right? But the issue is, if those correct moral judgments negatively impact the incumbent power structure of capital, then they will be suppressed by the very mechanisms that allow us to spread these stories. And I feel like these are the forces we're kind of discussing here, where we get representation, but we don't necessarily get nuanced representation.
Very much so. I'm going to shut up in a minute because I think I've done enough speeches. I do want to tell the viewers that if they're watching this, check out the description box. There will be a link to a YouTube channel called Curio, and they did a fascinating story about how the idea of monsters relates to superheroes and what they were using in this The Dark Knight Returns, which used to be one of my favorite comic books until Zack Snyder completely misunderstood it. and to be honest, elements of it which I never really understood and I imbibed and thought of, yeah, that's really interesting, kind of lends itself to another topic, which is superheroes and fascism, but we'll come to that. Check out the link, then you'll see a little bit more about how one idea of what is alternative has become mainstream, and that mainstream is not necessarily as progressive as it would like to believe it is.
So
oh, go on, Ola. I felt like you had more to say.
I just wanted to, I don't know if we're coming to the end of this discussion, but I feel like after, like, I'm asking, what can we tell each other? What's going to be the next thing? What can we replace it? How can we get a story, the right story, to get all of us working together to create a better society? And it seems like the answer is, well, we have to do levels, because people are at different levels, like the Gnosticism idea, you know, the idea of, well, you are at this level, and we have to actually acknowledge what people can absorb and then help them move up in stories. And it seems like we need nuanced, intersectional stories. So capitalism, a bit of revolution, a bit, like, basically we have to go through all the stuff that we had seen and just pick the best bits to create the next story, the things that worked and the things that didn't work. That's, I mean,
I think this is really ripe for discussion, and I have my own things to say on it, but I think it segues quite nicely into modern political stories and villains, which I know Olie had something to say on. So Olie, I don't know if you want to jump in now.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, yeah, it does kind of relate back to what Olie is saying. I think, so the one thing, yeah, when we were talking about this before, the one thing I wanted to raise, because it's a bit of a bugbear of mine, because I think in this discussion, I feel like certainly maybe I'm coming from it from a very broad strokes place, where I'm taking things wholesale as big concepts and using those as an example. And perhaps say John is looking at the actual things we're being presented with and looking at them individually as a critique, you know, as a traditional critique, as the art of critique, which is good. And that kind of maybe why we're ending up in two different places. But to go over to John's side of the aisle, really, I think the one thing that's really hacking me off lately is the fact that you just can't have bad guys anymore. To kind of elaborate, our sensibility, our modern, what do we call it the other day? Moral panic, our wish to look at everything in a relativist sort of way, which is very grown up and very healthy. But to look at everything in, you know, moral relativism has led us to a place where all of our stories are sort of shades of gray. It's that gray guy versus that gray guy, that slightly more gray guy versus the slightly lighter tinted gray guy, you know, and it's not only unsatisfying, but also kind of confusing. You move away from the point of the story in the first place, both philosophically and also in just, you have crap, terrible films, and then the whole of the Twitter sphere just saying nonsense, you know, like some people are just bad. Like I can't remember. There's a movie coming out of the Frank Herbert novel Dune, another version, and I hope with all my heart that it's really, really good, because I love that book. It's fantastic. But one of the points that was raised is in the original book, the sort of arch bad guy, the Baron Harkonnen. He is a very, very bad man. He is very bad. But one of the things that he does is he has a sort of a taste for young boys, and he likes to murder them and do unpleasant sexual things to them. And he's a bad man. Like, that's the point, is he's really awful. But there's a sort of a debate around this whole story, because it's like, well, we can't really have him be doing sort of, you know, homosexual stuff with young boys, because that's giving the wrong impression. We don't want to exclude, you know, gay men from this. We don't want them to feel offended by it. It's like, well, I'm fairly sure the murdering and pedophilia is the problem, not the boys. But, you know, like, this is the idea, is that, yeah, maybe at the time it was written, it was considered bad, but he's a bad person. And in the context of this story, that makes him bad. And he has to be bad in order for the story to function. He can't be a misunderstood narcissist or, like, you know, a guy in need of redemption. He's just bad. So that really annoys me. But then on the other hand, just quickly, you come into reality and you have the opposite, a place where you need people you dislike to be gray figures who disagree with you on economic stuff or social stuff, but are basically just human beings in the end, who have the same drives that you have. But then you want them to be really awful. You want them to be awful as possible so you can hate them as efficiently as possible. So then you end up with, like, scarecrow head numpties as the prime minister, who you think are the worst thing since Satan, and then wanting to make the guy in the story who is basically Satan be kind of all right and likable if you went down the pub. That drives me nuts.
Olie, you know what's really, really interesting? Because, like, I was going to come over to your side of the aisle regarding something that you said earlier, and I will do that. But what you just said, even though you're right, you can't really, like, mess with a certain text. You have to understand that, and I think you do, that ultimately the history when it comes to queer representation on screen in Hollywood, it's not particularly great. Like, apparently, if you're gay, you're going to be wearing a dress and killing people. Like, that seems to be what's happening in these films constantly. If I'm talking about Silence of the Lambs, if I'm talking about Psycho, like, so,
Or
you know,
Beyond the Valley of the Dolls.
You see, apparently if you're gay, then you're a psycho killer. I mean, what the fuck is going on? So there's that. But I will come over to your side of the aisle regarding something regarding capitalism and stories and superheroes. And in particular, it kind of ricochets a little bit of what Olie was saying before. My issue with Captain America is that I feel we know these stories, but perhaps as a culture, we needed to basically realize that not everyone was buying the fucking comic books. And so therefore, I have to be patient with culture as it tells these stories again through film. To the point that if you are watching The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, in that some of the ideas that they're talking about in regards to the buddy cop movie and the racial coding that goes in with that, and doing things for the optics and not necessarily because of what is right and wrong. There's some subtle story stuff in there which wouldn't be out of place on The Boys, which I think is the height of superhero TV. So that is my other olive branch to you, Olie. Olive branch, Olie, see what I'm doing here. Anyway, what else does anyone have to say?
I mean, this is a subject that's very, very close to my heart, because it's basically what I try to do in my creative output. Is I'm very concerned with how we tell stories in a way that actually open up subject matter rather than close it down, because people get up in arms, as Olie was saying, about specific moral ideas, and they have their own individual moral compasses about why something is wrong, why something is bad, the forces that make those bad things happen. And so for me, when I am doing my writing, I tend to focus on not, oh, this thing is happening that is making things bad, and more so focus on what is the actual bad thing. Because most of the time, people from both sides of the arguments can come together and agree that X is bad and shouldn't happen, but they have different ideas as to why it happens. But until you can actually get two people in a room to just come together and be like, we both agree this is a problem, and have different ideas about what's causing it, and have a discussion about that, you're just going to be creating scarecrows of each other and then throwing stones at them rather than engaging. And I do think we need to cultivate this more. Like, it's like I have two takes on Olie's take, basically. Like, I agree and I disagree, because in some ways, you know, like, I personally have problems with how in much more recent Star Wars media, there's this need to show like the morally ambiguous, or kind of, you know, you can kind of like this space Nazi. You know, like there's the Imperials who are actually kind of likable.
Embrace your inner space Nazi.
We got space Nazi in the show. All
Come
right.
hug me, space Nazi. It's okay, hug me.
I'm just glad we got space Nazi in the show. Yes.
But you know what I mean? Like you can have debates about it, but originally the idea behind the Empire was that they were based on Nazi aesthetic. And so it's kind of weird to then kind of distance from that and try and make it this both sides story when it has this kind of lineage of being a much more extreme thing. And to not engage with that, to not actually say, no, these are the bad guys. And maybe you can kind of empathize with one or two of them, but they are definitely evil. You know, I think there is a certain responsibility to do with how you tell a story. It's not that you can't empathize with a villain, but you need to be able to almost make an uncolored moral judgment. Or,
Okay,
you know.
I want to jump in here with the kill the Hitler baby story. Okay, you know, like that whole thing, like you go back in time and you're over Hitler's cradle. Yeah, do you do it? Do you do it? And then you kind of, speaking of Nazis again, there is a Doctor Who episode with Tom Baker where he has an opportunity to kill the Daleks, you know, and he had like, all he had was like, it was really funny. It's like, I think he had some water and an electrical wire. And he was there at the beginning when they just had a couple of they're gestating in a thing. And he's sitting there with these two pieces of wire. All he's got to do is like put them together. And he's debating, do I kill the Daleks, which is basically our version, the English version of the Nazis, right? And he's sitting there debating this, and like Sarah, who's the companion at the time, is like, just do it. But he's like, but think of all the people that they brought together. Think of all the civilization, you know. Ooh, that's a tough one.
Isn't it like I don't know if, I mean, maybe I'm being arrogant here, but essentially, isn't it reductionist to think that you can get rid of a bad idea by just dismantling the figurehead? I mean, you're not, you know, it's like the whole idea of Trump, like when everyone was really like just up in arms that he was happy, not up in arms, but just celebrating that he left. And I couldn't quite buy into that. I realized why people needed to do that. It was like a victory in lockdown, but you know, like just because he goes, like so much is still going wrong. So,
yeah, what he's brought to the surface is not going away. Marjorie Taylor Greene, anyone?
Yeah.
Fucking hell.
Okay.
But here's the thing though. But there you are. You're over Donald J. Trump's cradle. You're there. You're over Trump's cradle.
I'll tell you what I do, and I'll let people talk after this because I think I'm talking too much about this. Has anyone read Old Man Logan?
No,
yeah,
you have.
Just assume the answer is yes every time you answer one question.
I won't spoil the ending, but there is a way of going through life where it doesn't really mean that the hero has to, you know, off the bad guy. Maybe you can do something about the legacy which calls upon your maternal instincts. So read Old Man Logan, you'll see what I'm doing there. But for those who have read it and maybe want to have more of a clearer example, what I'm saying is a lot of these problems that we have come from man being afraid of himself. I'm not talking about humankind, I'm talking about the male and the male psyche.
Okay,
they're afraid of sex,
okay.
They're afraid of women, and they find ways to throw that into their literature. You know, Baron Harkonnen, yes, sure, he's a bad guy, and he's part of a really interesting story, but he is the result, again, of the othering of the homosexual, and using that without realizing it as a way of projecting that fear and that anger, you know.
Yeah, but you didn't answer my question. Are we gonna strangle Donald Trump? You know, you're over the cradle.
I did answer it, but you have to read Old Man Logan to know the answer.
Okay, forget about Old Man Logan. Just tell me, and I don't know what that means. I didn't get an answer.
If I tell you, then I'll be Okay, look.
Don't tell me
if there
Old Man
was-
Logan story. Just tell me, would you kill Donald Trump if you could, if you could go back in time, or if you were
Okay,
Hitler,
forward this video 20 seconds so you don't get the spoiler of Old Man Logan, right? You're doing it? Okay, good. Essentially, in Old Man Logan, you got an old Wolverine who finds like this Hulk baby, yeah, in the future.
He finds
and
a Hulk baby.
in the future, the Hulk has been smashing some shit up. He's gone insane, yeah, because the gamma radiation made him evil. Instead of Logan killing the baby, he takes the baby on the horse and he rides off into the sunset, presumably to raise that baby as his own. So if I was there above the Donald Trump baby or
Oh my
above the
God,
Hitler
you want to
baby,
raise Donald Trump? Oh,
because as a baby he was harmless. He
That's
didn't have
true.
any fear of people. That's what I say. All right. So
Okay,
if you're
all
at
right,
this point in the
thank you.
video, we've done the
Thank you.
spoiler. We've
Thank
done the
you for
spoiler.
clearing that
We've done
up.
the spoiler. Okay, cool. Matt, you're going to say something.
Yeah, I think what you're touching on is very important there, because it's where I was getting to with the why I kind of disagree with the necessity to have heroes and villains as well. Because on the other side of things, yes, there are examples in the past where we can say almost unmitigatedly these were bad people. They did bad things, whatever, but they were human and they had human drives. And most Nazis were not too dissimilar from who we are. And I think as a culture, we are very scared of that. And I think there is a necessity to, yes, whilst being able to still analyze and say someone's motivations were good or bad, to also say, I can analyze the moral complications of that situation and understand why it led there. I can disagree with it. I can disagree that Walter White, got to the position he was, but I can watch the transformation and understand why it happened. And I think there is a need to kind of, whilst still having these morality tales, be able to have a more adult a framework of analysis, so that when we look at these things, we can't just say, oh, well, it was evil, but it happened all that time ago. And when it comes again, we can see that psychology acting and we can understand where it's going. And you can only do that if you can have an adult story and adult conversation about these villains.
Yes.
Agreed. I think there's sorry. So there's one thing that I wanted to kind of raise here, because I think it spins background nicely. There's a thing that John mentioned, which I think is really interesting, when you were talking about sort of like so many things come out in stories, or so many things just come out badly because men are afraid of themselves, and I mean that as the sex. Men are afraid of themselves, and it's an interesting thing because, funnily enough, the sort of monomythical men group type people that I mentioned earlier, one of their big drives is one of their ideas in order to improve the world, for Olie here, is that there are elements of what is considered to be, manliness, which have been swept under the rug, that are often conflated with badness, which aren't really that, which aren't bad in and of themselves. They're just not popular. So there's an element where, for instance, like things like, man as a soldier, or man as a, as a sort of like a physically, man as physical violence is considered to be bad, which unrestrained, yes, it is. But there are times when that's important, and we can't ignore that or suppress it. And that perhaps so many of the problems we have are things like that, where we try and suppress something that needs to be engaged with. We tell people to be more sensitive, but then we don't necessarily deal with the fact that, there are elements which need to be addressed. There are cultures in which that is formally and constructively addressed, such as, with Sikhs, with martial arts and their way of dealing with it, where they take young men and don't force them, but encourage them into that thing, to explore that side of themselves. Because without exploring that, you end up with explosive violence, people who don't know what to do with their violent tendencies. School shooters don't come from nowhere. You know what I mean? Like, if
Yeah, but
it sounds, I sound like I'm about to suggest military service, but I'm not.
I'm in disagreement. I'm in a little bit of disagreement here with you in the sense that, like, men are not. I mean, women are violent. They're just socialized not to be, but they really are. I mean, I sometimes think I'm not suggesting that I agree with the guy who goes out to the pub and punches people, but sometimes it's like men can just like punch each other and then go, all right, we have a drink. And it's over. And the emotional torture and the emotional, they think, and women are just socialized to do it completely differently. They've got the same violence, they've got the same anger. They're just told to internalize it and not punch someone. Not saying that punching is the solution, but what I mean is a more straightforward, non-passive aggressive bullshit thing. A more straightforward, like, fuck you. Okay, fuck you. And then as opposed to,
I don't
mental.
know, man. I think the one thing to do that doesn't sound straightforward to me. That sounds like you got serious issues. Like punching someone and then punching you back, then having a drink and saying everything's fine doesn't sound like you're solving the problem.
But what I'm not saying I'm advocating violence as a solution, but what I'm trying to say is that there's a more honest approach of just let's just say we do it with words rather than punching, but just a more like straightforward, like, there is anger in women. There's so much violence in women. They're just told to button it up. And you're denying everything, the idea that Sikhs are allowed to explore it. And yet, when they're allowed to explore the anger of themselves as men. I mean, I'm sorry if I'm misinterpreting this, Olie, but like the idea is that women also feel the exact same things. That it's just not allowed to show it. They're just as angry.
Yeah, I think the one thing I want to just quickly spin around to there for the sake of context is the fact that I'm not in any way dismissing the women's side of this. It's just merely that in this context, the reason I'm talking about men is because there's a particular historical context to that, where women's struggle with that issue, it comes from a different place in our time as we are now. So I'm not discounting it. It's just that this is the particular aspect of, this is from my side of the table. So yeah, you're right. Yes, there are, I dislike to use the phrase, but like, yes, there are toxic elements to what society requires of femininity that are bad, in the same way that there are,
of the men by encouraging the violence of men and suppressing the violence of women. Or you know what I mean, like by men can. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, well, what I was going to say is that I think that in a way, there is oppression on both sides there. I think that, for instance, how do I go about this without going on to a huge lecture? Basically, what I'm getting at is the fact that for the issue that we have at the moment is that with the 20th century, there's a huge legacy of basically male violence ruining everything. And so we're afraid of it because of World War I and World War II and all the various wars in between. Men and women together have decided that we should just tamp this down and try and avoid blowing ourselves up, which is a noble goal. But then we never really explored any avenue to make it work. So we've half-assed it with sport and, things like that, but it's not really worked out so well. Obviously,
and horror films.
And horror films, yeah. But this is the thing, is on the women's side, you have a problem which is much longer, a longer history of suppression of maybe not violent tendencies, but, conflict and, regrets. That is a longer, much more difficult story.
I would say violence, anger, negative emotions, or aggression or assertion of any kind as well. Whereas men are suppressing the need to cry side. If you get what I'm saying. I'm just oversimplifying it, but yeah, you know what I mean? Like we're allowed to weep and be babies and and kittens and men are like
not allowed to cry, but they're allowed to punch it up, basically. Yeah. Okay, so I would like to move towards rounding off the podcast now. If anyone has anything they'd like to add before we sort of wrap things up, now's your chance. Anyone got anything to say?
Just because I think we are aware of this, but it would be remiss not to state that regardless of Olie, what you were saying, the idea that you weren't dismissing the feminine aspect of this, I don't think you were at all. I think what you were trying to say, at least this is how I interpreted it as, is that these people, these men who have had this fear of themselves have been the de facto storytellers from the beginning of time. It's, if you only really truly look at recent history in terms of women having their stories in print or given the chance to have those stories and ideas in celluloid, for them to actually permeate throughout a culture. You know, I mean, the idea of seeing a man cry in a film, it's actually still quite a recent thing. I know film hasn't been here for as long as, like, say, something like the Bible, but if you look at those old wartime stories, you wouldn't get the main character breaking down and crying. You know, you will get Kiefer Sutherland crying at the end of a long run of 24 on that. I used to love 24. It's a load of shit, but I used to love it. Hate me, I don't care. But essentially, you'd have this idea that the stiff upper lip, it wasn't just a British thing, it was a world-renowned thing, right? And so, you know, I think that just needs to be addressed.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, it's very important. Okay, well, I think there's a lot more to say here. I think we definitely will need to sort of reconvene, talk a little more about, you know, influence of capital, maybe sort of the narrative, the male versus the female narrative and how it affects our journey into the present day. I can see a lot of new avenues opening up there, but for now, I think we can kind of tie it off. So I'd like to take this moment to thank my my lovely panel for being here today. I had an absolutely electric conversation tonight. Yeah, I'm going to give you all a chance to introduce yourselves to us, as we're usually ideologically conversation-driven and not personality-driven. We leave this to the end rather than the beginning. But I think it's time you learned a little more about everyone who's been talking at you for the past hour. So let's start with Ola. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Why, thank you, Gap. Man. Yes, I'm Ola's Cool Kitchen, and I do a radio show. And you can follow me on Mixcloud. And I do it because good music has no boundaries, and mainstream radio sucks.
Awesome stuff. Cool. All right. And yeah, Olie, do you want to tell us a little bit about what you do?
So I am a musician and a music producer. I play with several groups and produce lots of stuff, most recent of which is Dorja, so you can check them out. And also some other times people call me a philosopher, apparently. So this is a thing I'm embracing now. It's just happening.
I fully appreciate you as our resident philosopher. I did an A-level. I'm probably nowhere near as well read as you, but it's very nice to have someone bringing that aspect to the conversation. Cool, thank you so much for that. And John, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, firstly, Matt, thank you so much for moderating today. Like, it was your first time out and you have steered this USS RantboxTV through nebulas of confusion and wonderful logic. So well done, well done. I am John Clay. I have been doing RantboxTV for the better part of a year now, starting in 2020. I am an author and a director. I've written a book about a man who is afraid of himself, and despite, or maybe in spite of his superpowers, causes himself a lot of mental distress. You can check that out by checking out the link in the box of description. And yeah, I've been recently getting some new work for music videos since the lockdown is starting to ease, so that's wonderful to know. Thank you for watching, guys. Matt, if you want to continue with your talk.
Thank you so much. Yes, this has been absolutely fantastic. Yeah, I just want to thank you once again for really wonderful discussion. This has been RantboxTV. We publish a new video every Friday. The relevant links to everybody's stuff will be in the description or in the bio or wherever abouts, depending where you're seeing this video. And yeah, I hope to have you join us next time. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yay. Goodbye.
Bye, guys.